The first sound was the leather sliding free, a harsh scrape that cut through the heat of the afternoon, and everyone in the town square seemed to lean toward it at once as if cruelty had pulled them by the collar. The stranger stood tied to the hitching post, his wrists secured with rope that had once been meant for horses, his shirt torn at the shoulder, dust streaking the sweat on his face, while the man with the whip rolled his wrist to test the weight, smiling the tight smile of someone who believed pain proved authority. She had only come for flour, a quick errand before the sun dropped, but the sight rooted her where she stood, because the moment had already decided what it wanted to become, and the crowd's silence felt like agreement being practiced. Someone muttered that the stranger had spoken out of turn, that he had refused to step aside, that he had insulted the wrong man, all reasons offered like tidy papers that could be filed and forgotten, none of them big enough to justify the rope or the leather. The sheriff lingered by the well, arms crossed, pretending to mediate while doing nothing at all, his eyes sliding away whenever the stranger tried to meet them, and the distance in that look struck her harder than the threat of the whip, because it said clearly that whatever was about to happen would be called order afterward. The stranger drew a slow breath, steadying himself, and in that small act she recognized something she had seen only a few times, a man deciding not to plead because pleading would make everyone else feel better about watching. The whipman announced the first stroke as if it were ceremony, lifting the leather high so the crowd could admire the shape of it, and a boy near her flinched while his father placed a hand on his shoulder and said nothing, teaching the lesson silence always teaches. Before she realized she had moved, she was walking, then crossing, then standing between the whip and the man tied to the post. Her heart climbing into her throat as the ground seemed to tilt beneath her, and a sharp intake of breath rippled through the square. Not admiration, not outrage, just shock at the interruption of an expected event. The whipman blinked as if a fly had landed in front of him, then laughed, low and irritated, telling her to step aside, calling her foolish, promising he would make it quick, and the sheriff finally spoke only to warn her that obstruction had consequences. She did not look at either of them. She looked instead at the stranger, who shook his head once, as if urging her away for her own sake, and that was precisely the thing that anchored her, because if no one else would refuse this, she would. Her voice surprised her with its calm when she said there would be no whipping today, the words quiet but unbendable, and as the whisper moved through the onlookers trying to decide whether to become courage or mockery, she heard boots behind her, measured and certain, and felt the air change before she saw them. The Apache brothers stepping forward, not rushing, not shouting, simply placing their bodies in line with hers, and in a heartbeat, the whip no longer pointed at one man, but at a wall no cruelty had planned on meeting. The square seemed to shrink as the Apache brothers took their places, one to her left and one to her right, shoulders squared, expressions unreadable, the stillness they carried more unsettling than any shouted threat, because it suggested they had already considered the cost and accepted it. The whipman's confidence faltered for a breath, a tiny crack that passed through the crowd like a ripple, and he tried to cover it with laughter, saying this had nothing to do with them, that the stranger had broken rules, and rules had to be enforced, his voice louder now, as if volume could restore authority. The sheriff straightened, suddenly eager to reclaim control without committing to it, warning the brothers that this was town business, not theirs, that stepping in would complicate matters, that no one wanted that trouble. And the brothers listened without moving, their silence answering every word more clearly than argument could. She felt the heat of the dust rising through her boots, heard the stranger behind her shift against the rope, and realized that the only thing holding the moment together was expectation, the expectation that someone with a whip would always win if the crowd agreed he should. One of the brothers finally spoke, voice low and patient, saying that men who raise leather to another man's back in daylight must be willing to explain why, and that explanation should be strong enough to survive being spoken aloud. The whipman sneered and muttered something about insolence, but he did not provide the reason, and that omission hung heavy, forcing everyone present to confront the thinness of the justification they had been prepared to accept. A woman near the bakery crossed her arms and looked away, as if choosing not to see were safer than choosing, and the sheriff, sensing his authority eroding, declared that no one would be harmed if everyone would simply step aside and allow the law to work. The brother on her right answered that law had every chance to speak and had chosen silence, which meant the work had rolled downhill to those who still had voices, and the simplicity of the logic made the whipman flush with anger. He snapped the leather once, a warning crack that sliced the air inches from her shoulder, and reflex urged her to flinch, to leave, to survive. But the brothers did not move, and so neither did she, the three of them forming a line that felt less like defiance and more like clarity. Murmurs spread through the square, some accusing, some uneasy. Most uncertain, because cruelty denied its easy path became uncomfortable quickly. The sheriff stepped forward at last, placing his hand on the whipman's arm. Not to stop him, but to caution him, reminding him that every choice made in daylight carried witnesses, and witnesses had long memories. The whipman hesitated, caught between pride and consequence, and in that hesitation, the stranger behind her exhaled, a sound of disbelief that anyone had chosen him at. A moment when choosing him invited punishment. The brother to her left finally said that there would be no whipping today, not because strength demanded it, but because decency did. And as the words settled into the heat, something subtle shifted. The crowd's certainty fractured, the boy near the well reaching for his mother's hand, the baker closing his door, the spectacle unraveling before it could finish itself, leaving the whipman alone with a decision he had never expected to justify in front of those who were suddenly unwilling to help him carry it. The sheriff recovered first, smoothing his vest as though tidying the moment could restore order, and he announced that there would be a hearing later, that the stranger would remain tied until statements were gathered, that everyone should disperse and trust the process, words polished enough to sound reasonable, even as they left one man bound and another holding a whip. She felt anger rise, not hot but steady, because hearings promised tomorrow were the oldest trick in avoiding the truth of today, and the Apache brothers seemed to recognize it too, glancing once at each other, silently agreeing they had stepped too far to retreat into politeness. The whipman, sensing opportunity, smirked, and suggested that if a wall was going to stand between him and his orders, then perhaps the wall needed a lesson, his tone more taunt than threat, inviting the crowd back into its earlier posture of complicity. The sheriff warned him sharply, not out of conscience but out of fear, reminding him that starting something here would place blame squarely where it couldn't be shifted, and the whipman chafed under the implication, rolling the handle in his palm as if the tool itself might reassure him. Behind her, the stranger spoke for the first time, voice rough but steady, saying that he had done nothing except refuse to be pushed into the mud when told, that the man with the whip had taken offense at being met with dignity, and the plainness of the explanation made several heads turn because dignity was not usually spoken aloud. The sheriff shot him a warning look, ordering him to hold his tongue, and one of the brothers answered instead, asking why a man was punished for speaking while another was allowed to strike without consequence, a question that cut through the pretense like a knife and left the sheriff with nothing useful to say. The crowd shifted again, more of them finding excuses to drift away, unwilling to watch a scene whose righteousness was fraying under scrutiny, and the square began to feel larger, emptier, less certain of itself. The whipman's jaw tightened, humiliation threatening to replace authority, and in that dangerous space, pride often reached for escalation. But the sheriff stepped closer and told him quietly that if he swung again, he would have to own the result, because the town would remember the line that the brothers and the woman were drawing. She felt the truth of that statement settle around them. This was no longer about the stranger or even the whip, but about what would be allowed to stand in daylight without being named. The stranger shifted his weight, testing the rope, then stilled, trusting the line of bodies between him and the leather more than any promise coming from the well. The brother on her right spoke again, softer now, saying that they would walk with the stranger to the edge of town and untie him there, that anyone who believed this unfair could follow and explain why pain was required, and the invitation hung open, simple and devastating. The sheriff hesitated, then stepped back, unwilling to become the man who ordered violence into a wall built out of conscience. And as the whipman lowered the handle with a curse and turned away, it became clear to everyone who remained that nothing about this day would ever be as simple again as it had been a moment earlier, before one woman stepped forward and refused to agree. When they untied the stranger, the rope left pale grooves around his wrists, and he rubbed them once as if confirming that the pain he expected had not come, then nodded to her without speaking, gratitude restrained because too much of it might draw the wrong attention. The Apache brothers positioned themselves around the three of them, not in a showy escort, but with the quiet precision of men who understood how anger trailed behind humiliation, and together they began the walk out of town, past the well, the mercantile, the silent windows where curtains twitched and disappeared. The sheriff followed at a distance, maintaining the shape of authority without choosing a side, while the whipman lingered by the post, unraveling the coil of leather as if it might reassure him that something of his control still existed. Children watched from porches, eyes wide, sensing that something important was happening even though no one had announced it, and a few adults pretended to sweep dust from steps they had already swept, their silence a kind of nervous commentary. The stranger walked with a limp. He tried to hide, and she matched his pace without making a point of it, asking quietly where he'd been headed, learning he had been traveling to see a sister out on the flats, his refusal to kneel earlier born less of pride than of exhaustion. At the edge of the square, an older man muttered that escorts like this made trouble where none was needed, that the stranger should have taken his punishment and moved on, and one of the brothers turned just enough to meet the comment with a steady gaze that made the words collapse into throat-clearing. The road narrowed as they reached the outskirts, dust rising around their boots, the town growing smaller with every step, and the stranger began to understand the shape of the risk being taken on his behalf, his gratitude turning into a quiet worry he did not know how to express. The sheriff stopped at the last post, calling out that if anyone asked, he would say the decision had been made to release the man as a warning, his attempt to rewrite the day already in motion, and the brother on her left answered that the day would remember itself, with or without permission. They walked on until the buildings gave way to scrub and the sounds of town faded into wind and insects. And there the brothers paused, cutting the last strands that held the stranger's wrists together, leaving only faint marks that would disappear faster than the memory. She handed him a canteen, and he drank carefully, as if the water might vanish if he took too much, then thanked them in a voice that seemed unsure how gratitude was supposed to sound when it wasn't followed by debt. The brothers nodded and told him to take the north trail and not look back for a while, advice given without drama. And as the stranger limped away, the four of them stood in the dusty light, knowing that leaving him free had not ended anything. It had only moved the question of consequences farther down the road, where it would wait for them to answer it. They did not speak for a while after the stranger disappeared into the northern haze, each of them listening to the quiet as if it might confess what the town would decide next, and she felt the unease settle into her shoulders, heavier than fear because it carried time with it. The Apache brothers started back at a measured pace, neither hurried nor careless, their eyes traveling the ridgelines and brush, reading the land for movement humans usually missed, and she realized that the wall they had formed had not dissolved. It had simply changed shape, expanding to include whatever retaliation pride might choose. Halfway to camp, they stopped to water the horses tethered earlier that morning, and one brother asked if she regretted stepping forward, not as accusation, but as inventory. As if courage also required counting. She answered honestly that she did not regret refusing the whip, only the knowledge that refusing it had embarrassed men who might try to fix their embarrassment with harm, and he nodded as if this was the truest answer a person could give. By the time they reached the river crossing, the sky had shifted, the light thinning to late afternoon, and a hawk circled slow and patient overhead, its indifferent watchfulness somehow steadying. Camp stirred when they arrived, questions held back by courtesy until the elder approached, his gaze moving from her to the brothers and back again, understanding more from silence than any report could have told him. Over a low fire, they explained what had happened, not every word, just the bones of it, and the elder listened without interruption, hands folded loosely, the lines in his face deepening when he heard the part about the sheriff stepping aside rather than choosing. He said that daylight had a long memory, and that towns often tried to forget what daylight saw, and then he asked the only question that mattered, whether the stranger had been freed with dignity. When they answered yes, the conversation ended there, replaced by simple preparations. A watch posted, the horses moved closer, the children told to stay near the shelters until dusk. She helped gather wood, the familiar rhythm easing the tremor in her hands. And as the fire grew, she noticed the camp's reaction wasn't fear, but readiness, a quiet tightening rather than panic. One of the women pressed bread into her palm and said softly that walls made from conscience always cost something, but they were the only walls worth building, and the words struck her harder than praise. As evening came, smoke rose in thin columns, the air cooled, and the first stars appeared like careful promises overhead, yet beneath the calm she could feel it, the town's wounded pride moving like a weather front, not here yet but coming, certain as nightfall. She understood then that the true weight of what they had done would not be measured by the whip that never fell, but by whatever arrived in the dark to test whether the line they had drawn would still be there when no one else was watching. Night settled thick across the valley, the sounds of camp soft and deliberate, and she lay awake longer than usual, listening not to what was present, but to what might arrive, the way a person learns to hear absence when danger has announced itself earlier in the day. The Apache brothers sat near the outer ring of firelight, speaking in low tones, their attention moving between the shadows and the embers, and every so often one of them would rise, walk a slow circle, and return, as if teaching the dark that it could not enter unnoticed. When the first distant hoofbeats finally came, faint and irregular, she felt the muscles in her back tighten, not with panic, but with a strange clarity, the same sensation she had felt in the square when the whip lifted, the knowledge that a line was about to be tested. The elder stepped from his shelter, wrapped in a blanket, expression calm, and he nodded once to the brothers, who answered with quiet signals that told the story without words. Riders approaching, cautious, not yet certain whether they meant to threaten or pretend neutrality. The camp gathered without noise. Children pulled close, fires banked low so the light would not blind their eyes, and she moved with the others to the inner circle, the place where those who had stood earlier would stand again if needed. The hoofbeats drew closer, then stopped just beyond the edge of moonlit brush, and a voice called out. The sheriff's, carefully measured, asking to speak, insisting they meant no harm, that he had only come to clarify what had happened. The elder invited him forward but did not step back, and the sheriff rode into view with two men behind him, neither of them the whipman, both looking as if they would rather be somewhere else, their hands resting uneasily near their holsters as though habit had not yet decided to become violence. He said that the town had been troubled by the interference, that people feared chaos when citizens decided to stand against discipline, and he tried to frame the day as misunderstanding rather than cruelty, words polished to hide their edges. One of the brothers replied that chaos was what happened when men needed a crowd to feel righteous, that nothing disorderly had occurred except the refusal to hurt someone for no reason, and the statement hung between them, too plain to argue against without admitting more than the sheriff wanted to show. He shifted in the saddle, then said quietly that some were angry enough to come on their own if they believed the town had been shamed, and in that admission lay the truth he could not soften. The warning he had brought was both courtesy and abdication. The elder thanked him for the honesty and said they would be ready for whatever came, that the night belonged to everyone equally, and the sheriff, relieved to have delivered his burden, turned back toward the darkness, leaving behind the echo of hooves and the unspoken certainty that the next visit would not ask permission. When the sounds faded, the camp did not scatter or sleep, but settled into a deeper stillness, people taking their places like stones around a fire, and she felt the same wall forming again, not in a square this time, but in a circle under the stars, and knew that whatever came next would have to decide whether it truly wanted to walk into a line built from conscience rather than fear. The second set of riders came just before dawn, when the world was neither night nor morning and decisions felt easier to disguise, and she was already awake, wrapped in a blanket near the fire, when the distant rhythm began to separate itself from the wind. The Apache brothers stood without speaking, nodding to the others who rose with them, and the camp shifted into a quiet formation that felt less like preparation for a fight than for a conversation that might try to become one. The riders stopped at the outer edge again, but this time did not ask permission. 3 men dismounted and walked forward, shoulders squared with the brittle certainty of people who had rehearsed their outrage, and as they stepped into the moon's last light she recognized one as the man who had muttered near the square, another as a store clerk who had pretended not to watch, and the third as someone she did not know, perhaps a man who simply disliked lines he had not drawn himself. They claimed they had come to collect respect for the town, to make clear that no one overruled discipline, their words wrapped in civility that strained at its seams, and the elder listened as patiently as if they had brought a request instead of a threat. One brother asked them calmly what they wanted done now that the stranger was gone, whether they intended to whip the post to prove a point, and the absurdity of the question flickered across their faces before anger reasserted itself. The unknown man said that allowing people to stand in the way of punishment encouraged disobedience, that there had to be consequences, and she heard in his voice the familiar hunger of someone desperate not to feel small again. The elder replied that consequences had indeed arrived, not for the stranger, but for the idea that pain was easier than explanation, and the truth of it landed harder than any raised weapon. The clerk insisted that the town's pride had been damaged, that apologies were owed, and she stepped forward then, not with defiance, but with the steady tone she had found in the square, saying that pride was not a living thing that required blood, and that if apologies were needed, they might begin by recognizing how close they had come to turning a man into a spectacle. The words did not inflame the men so much as exhaust them, as if they had expected resistance they could push against, and instead found a wall that would not move, yet refused to strike back. Silence stretched, the kind that forces a person to stand inside their own reasoning, and one of the riders finally muttered that they should go, that nothing here would play the way the town wanted to tell it. Later, and slowly, with the awkwardness of men leaving an argument they could not win without becoming the villains of their own story, they turned and walked back to their horses. As hooves faded into the thinning dark, the camp did not cheer, did not relax, only breathed together, the line still there because it had never been about strength. It had been about choosing again and again not to step aside. When morning finally arrived in full, with gold light slipping through cottonwoods and smoke rising thin from rekindled fires, the tension eased in small, almost invisible increments, as if the land itself were reluctant to release what it had been holding. Yet the stranger did not vanish from their thoughts as easily as he had vanished down the north trail, and by midday he reappeared in the most unexpected way, not walking back into camp, but sending word through a young boy who had found him resting at a creek and carried his message with the solemnity of someone entrusted with something important. The message was simple. He had reached safe ground, he would continue on to his sister, and he had asked the boy to say that he had never before seen people refuse cruelty so quietly. The elder listened, nodded, and handed the boy food to take back, a gesture that carried more meaning than words, and the Apache brothers exchanged a look that acknowledged what they all understood, that stories traveled farther than riders, and the one born yesterday would not be contained by town lines. She felt something complicated settle in her chest, a mixture of relief and humility, because the man whose back she had shielded would likely never know how close the night had come to turning violent, nor how many choices had been required to keep it from crossing that line. Later, as she helped repair a torn strap and the camp settled into normal rhythms, a question kept circling her thoughts. What had made her step forward in the first place when so many stronger people had remained still? It wasn't bravery, she decided, at least not the kind people spoke about afterward, but rather a refusal she had carried for years, the refusal to watch someone be made small just to make other people feel big. When she shared this quietly with one of the brothers, he nodded as if she had explained something he had recognized in his own bones, and he said that sometimes strangers arrived not to be saved, but to reveal what kind of place they had walked into. That afternoon, a few members of the camp who had doubted the wisdom of challenging the town came to sit with her while mending nets, not to apologize, but to be near the calm they had witnessed, their presence a quiet acknowledgement that the story had changed something inside them. The day unfolded gently, and when sunset painted the valley, she realized that the stranger, far from disappearing, had become a thread woven into the camp's understanding of itself, a living reminder that what had happened in the square was not about one man being spared a whip, but about an entire community discovering, in front of witnesses, that it was capable of drawing a line and holding it. 2 days later, when the wind shifted and carried the faint smell of dust from the north, she knew before anyone spoke that the story was not done, because unfinished things had a way of turning themselves back toward the people who tried to ignore them. A scout returned by mid-morning with word that 3 riders had been seen trailing the stranger's path, not close enough to approach, but close enough to follow, and the realization threaded through camp like a quiet alarm. Whatever pride the town had failed to reclaim in daylight, it now meant to collect on the open road. The Apache brothers saddled their horses with the calm efficiency of men who understood that prevention was easier than regret. And when she insisted on riding with them, they hesitated only long enough to measure whether her presence would help or complicate, then nodded, because some choices, once made in a square, could not be unmade on the trail. They moved quickly across the valley, following the faint tracks where hooves had pressed into softer ground, the landscape widening into low hills and broken rock, the kind of country where sound traveled far and consequences arrived silently. By late afternoon, they spotted dust ahead, not the steady plume of a traveler, but the indecisive scatter of men who rode without purpose except to make someone nervous. And at a narrow canyon pass where the world funneled into stone and shadow, the brothers signaled to halt. The stranger was there, walking his horse up the incline, aware enough of the danger to keep moving, unaware enough not to see who followed, and when he turned at the sound of their approach, confusion gave way to relief and then to worry, because the math of 3 riders behind him and 3 riders ahead rarely solved peacefully. The brothers positioned themselves with the same deliberate clarity they had shown in the town square, one taking the high edge, the other settling near the narrowest point, while she rode to the stranger's side and told him quietly that the safest thing he could do now was to trust the people who had already refused to let him be hurt once. Moments later, the riders arrived, faces flushed with effort and the awkwardness of intent that no longer sounded heroic when spoken aloud, and they tried at first to frame their presence as concern, as a desire to escort him back to answer for what had happened. The elder was not there to speak, so one brother took the role, saying that the road belonged to anyone who needed it, and that men who followed others with whips in their pockets should think carefully about why they needed witnesses so badly. The canyon amplified every word, leaving no place for excuses to hide, and the riders realized one by one that they had come too far to pretend, and not far enough to force anything without becoming the story they feared. After a long, uncomfortable silence, they turned their horses and retreated the way they had come, smaller, now not defeated by threat, but by the stubborn presence of people who refused to make cruelty convenient. The stranger watched them disappear, then looked at her and the brothers with a gratitude that did not try to find language, and together they finished the pass in quiet, the path opening ahead like something earned rather than borrowed. They saw him safely beyond the last ridge, where the land sloped into open country and the road carried on like an unbroken sentence. And there the stranger dismounted for a moment, placing his hand against his horse's neck as though grounding himself before speaking. He said that he would remember the wall more than the whip, because a man can forget the shape of fear if he keeps walking long enough, but he does not forget the faces of people who refuse to let fear decide for him, and the simplicity of that statement felt larger than any blessing. She told him he owed nothing, that their actions had been about who they were, not who he was. And one of the brothers added that stories either grew or shrank depending on how honestly they were lived, which meant this one had been worth the risk. The stranger thanked them again, then rode on, and they watched until he became another figure, swallowed by distance, not rescued, not owned, simply allowed to continue without being humiliated first. The journey back to camp was quieter, the air softer now that the choice had finally carried itself all the way to its end, and she felt the relief settle in places deep inside her that had been braced for consequences since the first crack of leather in the square. When they arrived, the elder listened to their account with the same patient attention he always gave to things that might become lessons, and he nodded when he heard about the canyon pass, saying that sometimes justice looked like nothing more than refusing to move at the exact moment movement would have been easiest. That evening the camp gathered, not for celebration, but for the ordinary rhythm of food, mending, and talk. And she found herself laughing at a small joke, surprised by how natural the sound felt after days of tension. One of the women remarked that courage had a way of changing where a person stood, even when they returned to the same place, and she realized the truth of it. She would buy flour again someday, walk the same road into town, see the same faces, but the line she carried inside would travel with her, unshakable. As night gathered, the elder spoke quietly to the children, telling the story without names, focusing not on the stranger or the whip, but on the decision to stand between what is easy and what is right. And the children listened with the alertness of those who know they are being invited into something they may need later. When the fire burned low and everyone drifted toward sleep, she sat a little longer, watching sparks twist upward, thinking about how quickly crowds forget, and how slowly those who stood remember, and she understood that what remained after everything else faded was not glory or praise, but a simple, steady fact. When the day had asked for someone to refuse, she had done so, and others had chosen to stand with her. And that truth, carried quietly, was going to outlast the whip, the square, and even the story itself.